When the storm rolled in, no one moved except the one man they all thought had retired years ago. Thunder Ridge smelled like grease and sunburnt metal. Emily Ford stepped off the bus with her duffel bag slung over one shoulder and the wind kicking dust into her eyes. She squinted through the heat shimmer toward the hangars, big, sharp silhouettes framed against the mountains. The others were already there. She walked fast but quiet. Her boots weren't regulation issue. They had scuffs older than half the cadets on this base. Her flight suit fit well enough, though the right sleeve was slightly faded, the kind of details someone like Carter would spot from a mile away. And he did. "Look what we got here," Carter called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Didn't know we were training museum exhibits this cycle." Some laughter, nothing full-throated, just sharp and dry. Emily said nothing. She kept walking. Alex caught up with her near the lockers. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I'm fine," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite land. "It's just noise." That afternoon, they ran drills on basic airframe inspection. Carter, towering, loud, full of that overconfident energy cadets mistake for leadership, assigned her the dirtiest task crawl beneath a UH-1 scrub hydraulic leaks with a toothbrush. "Good luck." Notebook, he grinned, tossing a busted rag toward her boots. "Hope your pen doesn't smudge down there." Emily didn't answer. She crouched under the belly of the bird, the rotors creaking gently overhead as if watching. From the shadows beside the maintenance bay, a figure watched too, quiet, unmoving. His gray shirt was tucked but dusty, his hands behind his back. He said nothing. No one noticed him, except Alex. That night, Emily sat at her bunk, flipping through her notebook. Her hands smelled like degreaser. The others were out grabbing energy drinks, loud with confidence they hadn't earned yet. Alex sat across from her. "You don't have to put up with him. You know." "I do," she replied, "because I don't want this to be about my last name." He hesitated. "Then you think he knows who you are?" Emily looked up, eyes steady. "Doesn't matter. I'm not calling him." Alex nodded, slowly, said nothing more. But later that night, when Emily was asleep, face turned toward the wall, hands curled around the notebook like a lifeline, Alex stepped out into the hallway, pulled out his phone, hesitated, then typed a number from memory. He listened to the line ring once, twice, then it clicked. No greeting, just quiet breathing on the other end. Alex spoke, voice low. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but it's happening again." And she won't say a word. "Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe." The desert hummed low and constant. Miles away from Thunder Ridge, under a pale orange sky, a dust-covered SUV pulled off a forgotten road and rolled to a slow stop beside an old hangar. Inside, Harrison Ford sat alone, back straight, hands resting quietly on his thighs. A single overhead bulb buzzed above a scratched-up map of the Rockies, pinned to the wall. Wind tapped at the sheet metal siding. His phone was still in his hand. No words had passed, just the voice of a young man, shaky, careful in silence in reply. Ford stood, slowly, no sudden movements. He'd heard enough. He folded the map once, then again, tucked it under his arm. Back at Thunder Ridge, the sky was beginning to cloud, but no one looked up. Inside the hangar classroom, Carter was pacing. "Tomorrow's eval's going to break a few of you," he announced, pointing a metal pointer at the emergency landing schematic. "So if anyone needs to run home to Grandpa tonight, speak now." Eyes flicked toward Emily. She didn't flinch, just took notes. Carter smirked, walked past her desk, and knocked her pen out of her hand. It clattered. "I said speak now," he repeated. Emily met his eyes. Calm, flat. "I didn't say a word. Maybe you should worry about your own landing pattern." That earned a few quiet chuckles, but Carter's jaw tightened. That night, Emily stood at the back of the base, staring out at the flight line. The air was dry, heavy. A storm was building somewhere far off, low and growling behind the hills. She took out her notebook, opened to a blank page, wrote, "You taught me the sky doesn't care about who you are, just how steady your hands are when it all falls apart." She paused, looked up. She could almost hear his voice, not speaking, not directly, just presence, that quiet steadiness that had always been there, even when she didn't ask for it, but she wouldn't call him, because this wasn't his battle, because this one was hers. Hours later, the sound of tires on gravel. The old SUV rolled to a stop just outside the airfield's security fence. Its headlights flicked off. Inside, Ford sat silently for a moment, then opened the door, stepping out into the wind. He wore a faded flight jacket, no name patch, just the kind of fabric that held memory. He looked up at the hangars. A storm was coming. You could smell it in the grit. You could feel it in your bones before it ever showed on radar. He knew that kind of weather, and the kind of girl who'd try to face it without calling for backup. Morning cracked open with thunder low on the horizon. Inside Hangar 4, the cadets were already lined up, boots polished, back straight, eyes flicking toward the weather every few seconds. Rain hadn't started yet, but the wind had teeth now. A bad kind of wind. The kind that told you today wasn't going to go by the manual. Emily adjusted her gloves, kept her gaze ahead. Carter was talking, loud as ever. Today's simulation is search and retrieve. Low altitude navigation, tight weather window. We're going out in teams. You mess up, you ground the whole crew. So if anyone here wants to be a weak link, speak now. Silence. Carter's eyes drifted to Emily, lingered, then to Alex, standing beside her. Or maybe you want someone else to make that call for you. I hear some people have famous emergency contacts, a few snickers. Someone nudged someone else. Emily didn't move, but Alex tensed. Before he could open his mouth, the hangar door creaked. A gust of wind shoved it wider. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Harrison Ford stepped inside. He didn't stride. He walked like he belonged there, not just in the hangar, but in whatever storm was waiting on the other side of it. His jacket looked like it had crossed countries. His face looked like it had crossed time. Carter blinked. "Can I help you?" Ford didn't answer immediately. He looked around, slow and calm, eyes landing briefly on Emily, but he didn't acknowledge her. Not directly. Then he turned toward Carter. "I'm not here to help, just here to observe." Carter chuckled under his breath. "Nice. We got a tourist." Ford raised one eyebrow. "Just slightly. I was flying rescue ops while you were still getting yelled at for your shoelaces. So maybe hold the comedy until after the storm passes." A beat of silence. Carter shifted. "You shouldn't be on this base without clearance." From behind, a voice spoke. "He doesn't need clearance." Everyone turned. Colonel West had entered quietly, clipboard in hand. He nodded once toward Ford, then looked to the rest of the room. "That storm outside, it's tracking hard south. Worse than expected. A civilian aircraft went down couple miles east of the canyon wall. We're coordinating SAR now." Murmurs rippled. Someone cursed under their breath. Carter cleared his throat. "With all due respect, sir, no one should be in the air right now. Visibility's trash. Updrafts are insane." West looked at him, not unkindly, but firm. "We're not asking you to fly. You're not on the list." A voice from near the back cut in. "Then who is?" And as if on cue, all eyes turned back to the man standing quietly in the hangar. Harrison Ford just adjusted his sleeves. Didn't say a word. Rain finally came. Not a downpour. Not yet. Just sharp, cold needles in the wind, tapping against metal roofs and flight visors. Inside the ops tent, Colonel West stood over a tactical map while voices swirled through radios. The screen beside him showed radar pulses, red bands thickening. Everyone knew what it meant. Ford stood off to the side, calm, hands behind his back. His presence didn't fill the space with noise. It quieted it. Even the youngest cadets could feel it, though none had the words. West turned, voice low. Still time to back out. Ford replied without moving. Still time to die waiting. West exhaled, almost smiled. You haven't changed. Ford did smile barely. You did. You grounded yourself. The colonel's eyes darkened. I had to. You remember why? There was a pause. Not heavy, just full. Ford nodded. I do. A long second passed. Then West looked down at the map. I've got a team ready for evac support. If you get her out, I will. Ford said, no ego, just fact. Back at the hangar, the tension had shifted. Carter paced, arms crossed, biting his lip. The cocky edge was gone, replaced with something harder to name. Emily watched the sky. She knew that weather. Her grandfather used to call it a liar's sky. It looked passable from the ground. But up there, it would try to break your bones. She heard boots behind her. Carter. You think this is impressive, he muttered. Him walking in here like some legend, stealing the room. She turned. He didn't steal it. You gave it to him. Carter stepped closer. He's not you. He's a relic. Emily didn't blink. That relic has pulled more people out of wreckage than you've pulled all-nighters. Carter's mouth twitched, but before he could respond, the base-wide PA cracked on. All personnel stand by. Emergency briefing in 5. Civilian pilot inbound for search and rescue. Confirmed it's Harrison Ford. The room stilled. The statement hung in the air like a bell still ringing. Minutes later, outside the hangar, the cadets lined the tarmac. Rain slicked their shoulders, pooled in the cracks between concrete slabs. They watched as the old Bell 412 powered up rotors slow, then quicker, chopping the air like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. Ford climbed in, movements efficient, not rushed, just focused. West stepped up to the door before it closed. You sure about this? Ford didn't look at him. We don't fly because it's safe. We fly because someone's still waiting. Then he lifted off, and the storm welcomed him like an old rival. The helicopter climbed like it remembered how, old maybe, outdated by newer models with flashier avionics, but reliable, like its pilot, inside the cockpit. Harrison Ford adjusted the cyclic, eyes locked forward, the familiar hum of engine vibrations settling into his bones. His headset crackled softly, a voice from base trying to update him on wind vectors. He didn't answer. Didn't need to. At a certain point, flying became less about instruments and more about instinct. He wasn't looking for stability, he felt for it. Below, the terrain blurred under sheets of rain and cloud breaks. Trees looked like dark wounds in the landscape. The ravine was out there somewhere west of the ridge. If the civilian pilot's distress ping was correct, no confirmation yet, just static and time slipping fast. Back at Thunder Ridge, cadets watched the radar in a huddle. Still can't believe he went up in that. One whispered, he's got to be, what, 8079. Emily corrected, quietly. Carter was silent. Alex stood behind them, arms crossed. Why'd he come? Emily looked down at her notebook, then back at the screen. Because someone needed to. Inside the chopper, turbulence grabbed the skids like a drunk trying to throw punches. The tail kicked once. Ford compensated without thinking, adjusting trim and throttle with the grace of someone who didn't have to prove anything to the sky. He scanned the ridge line, and there just below a clearing, near a jagged tree line, a flash of silver. Wreckage. He dipped low, nose slightly angled to account for wind shear. The sight was narrow, cluttered with broken pine and metal. Smoke coiled upward, thin and desperate. He spotted movement. 2 survivors, one waving frantically, the other sitting limp, maybe unconscious. No telling if the frame would hold. And the terrain wasn't friendly. He keyed the mic. Thunder Ridge. This is Echo 7. Visual on crash site. 2 survivors. Coordinates inbound. Static. Then West's voice, copy that. Echo 7. Reinforcements are grounded. You're solo. Ford didn't flinch. Solo's enough. He scanned the clearing again. Not a flat surface anywhere. Didn't matter. Back at base, the wind howled against the hangar doors. The radar showed a heavy cell moving straight over the crash site. Emily stood motionless. Then softly she spoke. He's not just flying in a storm. He's showing us how to face one. No one responded, but Carter's jaw tightened. His hand slowly curled into a fist, then released. In the cockpit, Ford exhaled through his nose. Focused. All right, old man, he muttered to the controls. One more time. The chopper tilted, hovered, edged its skids toward a deadfall that looked just stable enough to hold weight for 60 seconds maybe. The wind screamed. He didn't. Rain clawed at the windshield, the blades sweeping furiously as if fending off the sky itself. Ford squinted through the blur, hands steady on the controls. The Bell 412 shuddered, but held barely. Below, twisted trees and jagged rocks left no room for error. The rotor wash kicked up debris, trying to blind him. He leaned forward. There, just to the right of a splintered pine, the survivor in the red jacket raised one arm again, this time shielding the unconscious pilot beside them. Ford hovered. Tight space, no margin. He opened the side door. No co-pilot, no crew chief. Just him. He reached back, unhooked the evac harness. Rain lashed the inside of the cabin. The air smelled of scorched fuel and wet pine. He clipped in. All right, he muttered. Let's dance. At Thunder Ridge, the storm had moved in full. Radar was a wall of red. In the hangar, the cadets stood frozen around the comms panel, voices low. Still can't get a signal. No, man, it's just static. Colonel West stood behind them now, arms crossed, face unreadable. Emily stepped forward. She stared at the map, at the blinking dot frozen over the ridge. Then she looked at West. Why'd he stop flying? West didn't answer right away. Then finally, because one night, a storm won, the room went quiet. He got everyone back alive. But one rotor blade cracked on the landing. If it had failed 10 seconds earlier, he'd be dead, and so would 6 kids. He looked toward the wind outside. He said flying's not just skill, it's judgment. Knowing when your luck's about to run out. Emily said nothing, but deep down, she already knew he didn't fly today because it was smart. He flew because someone had to. Back in the chopper, Ford slid the harness rope down, bracing with one hand as the wind shoved the aircraft sideways. He gritted his teeth, corrected, then locked eyes with the survivor below. He gave a single nod, lowered the harness. The young woman grabbed it, clipped it to the limp pilot beside her, arms trembling from the cold and fear. Ford could see it in her face, the doubt, the disbelief that anyone had come at all, especially him. He pulled the winch, slow. The rotor dipped, he adjusted again. As the survivor rose into view, her eyes never left his. Rain smeared across her face like war paint. Then she was in. He moved fast, unclipped, turned back to the edge. The second trip would be harder. Less strength, less visibility, less time. He hesitated for half a breath, then went again. And somewhere between the storm's roar and the rise of the rotors, a truth echoed in the wind. This was never about being the best pilot in the sky. It was about showing others what it looked like to hold your line. Even when the sky tried to erase it, the chopper swayed violently as Harrison Ford pulled the last of the harness back in. The second survivor, barely conscious, soaked, bloodied, slumped to the floor with a faint groan. Ford didn't pause. He knelt beside him, checked his breathing, then reached for the med pack under the seat. Still with me, kid, he murmured. I didn't come up here to carry home a ghost. No response, but the chest moved. Shallow, uneven but alive. That was enough. Ford turned back toward the cockpit, grabbed the throttle, and paused. Just outside the windshield, the ridge disappeared behind a curtain of slate-gray rain. Wind clawed at the fuselage. Visibility barely a whisper, and still he flew. At Thunder Ridge, the hangar doors strained against their hinges. Colonel West stood at the entrance, arms locked behind him, eyes searching the clouds as if he could see through them. Emily stepped beside him. Her hair was damp, her voice quiet. What happens if he doesn't make it? West didn't turn. Then we remember him for what he did, not for how it ended. Emily looked down. Her fists were tight. Alex joined them. But if he does make it, then what do we say? West finally turned to face them both. Then you watch, you listen, and you carry it forward. A crack of thunder punctuated his words. The lights flickered. The storm was getting closer. Inside the cockpit, Ford's knuckles whitened around the cyclic. Terrain alarm blared once false reading. The sensor was useless now. He tuned it out. Below, the ravine dropped into shadow. Jagged rock, no flat space, no mercy. He climbed, smooth but firm, found altitude, found breath. Thunder Ridge, this is Echo 7. 2 survivors on board, returning to base. No reply. Repeat, this is Echo 7. Coming home. Still nothing. He adjusted frequency, and then finally through a wall of static, copy that. Echo 7. We've got you on partial. Radar shows cell moving northeast. He exhaled. Quiet. No celebration. Just focus. He'd flown worse, but not much. At the base, the tower lit up. Echo 7 inbound voices echoed in the hangar. Cadets rushed outside, jackets flying. The wind caught their words and flung them across the tarmac. Emily pushed through them, eyes fixed on the dark patch of sky beyond the tree line. Then the faint, unmistakable rhythm. Rotor blades, slow, steady, defiant. Out of the cloud cover, like a ghost with purpose. The Bell 412 emerged nose-dipped, spotlight cutting through the haze. He was coming in low, controlled. Ford eased the chopper down onto the wet concrete just outside the emergency bay. The moment the skids kissed ground, medtechs rushed in. He didn't leave the cockpit right away. He sat back, closed his eyes, listened to the rain on the glass. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was something else. The kind of silence that only comes after you've shouted back at the storm and survived. The rotors slowed to a whisper. Ford stepped down from the helicopter, soaked through and silent. His boots hit the tarmac with the finality of someone who didn't need applause to know he did the right thing. Medics brushed past him, taking the 2 survivors, one on a stretcher, one walking with help. Neither said a word, but both looked back at him as they passed like they weren't sure if they'd imagined him. In some ways, maybe they had. Inside the hangar, cadets were still gathered by the entrance. The storm had eased, but their nerves hadn't. Emily was the first to move. She marched out onto the tarmac. Her pace was sharp but hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she had the right to approach him yet. Not after what he just did. Ford didn't notice her at first. He was rolling up a wet sleeve, his hands trembling just enough to betray the strain he'd hidden. She stopped a few feet away. "Grandpa." He looked up. There was no smile, just eyes that softened slightly. He nodded once. "That was enough." "You didn't have to." "I did," he said, quiet but firm. "You know I did." Emily swallowed. "I didn't want you to think I couldn't handle it, that I needed saving." Ford shook his head. "You don't need saving, but sometimes people need reminding." She frowned. "Reminding of what courage looks like." He stepped forward, placed a hand on her shoulder. The kind of hand that had pulled lives from fire, that had held the weight of more than controls. "You didn't call me. I respect that. But someone saw something they couldn't stand by and watch." She glanced toward Alex, standing back in the shadows of the hangar. "He called you." Ford nodded. "He knew something you'll figure out, too. Bravery isn't about staying quiet through pain. Sometimes it's about calling the right voice when it counts." Emily's jaw clenched, not from shame, but from something deeper. Understanding. Maybe, from across the tarmac, Carter stood frozen. He had watched it all unfold. The arrival, the rescue, the landing, and now this. Something inside him, something loud had gone quiet. Ford turned then, met his eyes. No words, just presence, the kind that didn't need to be louder to be stronger, and Carter looked away first. Inside the command tent, Colonel West watched the monitors. The storm cell had moved on. Blue patches were breaking through the gray. A comm officer stepped in. "Sir, survivors are stable. Minor injuries." West nodded, then looked out across the field where Harrison Ford stood with his granddaughter. "He still flies like it's personal," the officer muttered. West didn't take his eyes off the window, because to him, it always was. The storm passed with no fanfare, just a slow retreat of the wind, and light breaking through torn clouds, like the world had taken a long breath it didn't realize it was holding. By midday, the cadets gathered in the central field, uniforms soaked at the edges, some still shivering from more than cold. No drills, no shouting, just quiet. Colonel West stood at the front alone for a moment, his cap in hand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You all saw what happened today." A few glances, a few nods. Carter looked down at his boots. "You saw someone fly into a storm no one else dared enter. Not for glory, not for a medal, but because there were people out there waiting, and he didn't want them to wait alone." He looked toward the hangar. Ford was gone. No goodbyes, no speech, just his jacket still hanging on a nail in the ready room. Old leather, cracked in the shoulders. Probably older than some of the cadets standing here. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask who would watch. He just went. West paused, eyes scanning them. That's not arrogance. That's responsibility. Emily stood still in the front row. Beside her, Alex straightened his back. Even Carter lifted his eyes. You'll hear stories about him now, maybe already have. About his years flying helicopters through fires, floods, combat zones. But what you saw today wasn't legend. It was character. The silence that followed was thick, not heavy with grief, but with realization. Some of them looked older now, not in years, in weight. One day, you'll have someone depending on you, and the weather won't be right, and the odds won't be good, and no one will be watching. West set his cap back on. I hope you remember today, not because of what he flew through, but why he flew at all. He stepped back, then gestured toward the open sky. Dismissed. As the cadets broke formation, Emily lingered. She walked to the hangar. Her boots echoed in the quiet. Inside, she reached for the old leather jacket. Fingers brushed the worn collar. In the pocket, something crinkled, a folded slip of paper, her name on it, written in that stubborn, all-cap handwriting. She unfolded it. It wasn't long. Emily, we don't get to pick the weather, only how we show up in it. Keep flying. Her hands tightened around the note, and for the first time since he landed, she let herself cry. Not from fear, not from relief, but because she knew that storm wasn't the last, and he'd just shown her how to meet the next one. 3 days passed. The storm was old news. The wreckage had been cleared, the survivors discharged with minor injuries. And yet, something still lingered at Thunder Ridge, not in the air, but in the way people walked, looked, spoke. Something had shifted. They weren't just cadets anymore. They were inheritors. Colonel West found Emily in the observation tower at dawn. She was sitting cross-legged, hood up, a mug of instant coffee between her hands. Fog crept across the tree line below, like it was trying to remember where the storm had gone. He stepped inside quietly. Didn't speak right away. You know, when he was younger, Ford used to land helicopters like he was placing glass on a shelf. Didn't matter what the sky was doing. Emily smirked faintly. Sounds like him. West leaned on the rail beside her. I once asked him why he still flew when he didn't have to. Why he didn't just stop. And he said, because flying is how I tell the truth. Emily stared out into the fog. He didn't even wait for applause. West nodded. The real ones never do. Later that afternoon, during equipment checks, A commotion stirred in the hangar. A new delivery had arrived. A box, plain and unmarked, addressed to Thunder Ridge Flight School, Cadet Division. Inside one thing, Ford's flight helmet, scuffed, faded, the kind of gear that carried stories in its scratches. Taped to the side was a note, short, handwritten. Let 'em wear this only when they've earned it. Until then, hang it where the wind gets in. They mounted it high on the wall above the hangar entrance, where sunlight hit just before noon. That night, the cadets sat around the fire pit for the first time in weeks. No instructors, no structure, just stories. Not about medals, not about records, about a man who flew through a storm with no promise of landing, about what it meant to be the kind of person who didn't wait for permission to do the right thing. Emily sat with Alex, her feet up on a wooden crate. She looked at the sky. It was clear, silent. He's probably flying somewhere right now, Alex said, half smiling. Just didn't tell anyone. Emily nodded. Her voice was soft. No, he's not flying. He's watching. Alex turned to her. Watching what to see if we remember. And somewhere far beyond the clouds, or maybe just beneath them, there was the sound of old rotors turning, faint as memory, not to impress, not to prove, just because someone had to. And that was always enough. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.